Good day, everyone. I'm pre-recording this one precisely because I'm not present today. Let's look at the abstract first for slides 1 to 31. So the lecture introduces phenomenology as a major movement in 20th century European philosophy by presenting it as a disciplined return to experience, beginning with Edmund Husserl and the intellectual environment of neo-Kantianism, logism, idealism, pragmatism, positivism, empiricism, and philosophies of life. The discussion shows how phenomenology emerged from dissatisfaction with philosophical approaches that allowed inherited theories and conceptual systems to determine how reality should be understood. Its basic demand is simple but radical. Before explaining reality, philosophy must attend carefully to how things actually appear with experience. In slides 1 to 31, the lecture traced the historical background of the term through Lambert, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel before turning to the more immediate influence of Franz Bertano and Ernst Mach. Brentano is especially important for his descriptive psychology and account of intentionality. Consciousness is not an isolated container of mental contents. It is always directed toward something. We see something, remember something, fear something, desire something, love someone. This directedness establishes an essential relationship between consciousness and the world and provides an important foundation for Husserl's philosophical project. Husserl develops this insight through what he calls the return, uh, he's called to return to the things themselves. Philosophy, he says, should resist imposing assumptions upon experience and instead allow what appears to show itself according to the manner in which it is given. This requires a disciplined suspension of habitual judgments. Husserl's principle of presuppositionlessness therefore asks the philosopher not to deny existing knowledge, but temporarily to place inherited explanations and assumptions in bracket so that the experience itself can be examined more carefully. The epoche expresses the suspension, while the eidetic and transcendental reductions deepen the investigation by asking what is essential to an experience and how something becomes meaningful within consciousness. Central to this method are the notions of intuition and givenness. Intuition does not simply mean instinct or feeling. It refers to the direct presence of evident disclosure of what is being examined. What is genuinely given must be received according to the way it gives. Philosophy, therefore, begins with attention before interpretation, description before judgment, careful seeing. The investigation eventually leads Husserl towards the Lebenswelt or life world, the meaningful world in which human beings are always already living before scientific and theoretical abstraction. Before water is chemically defined, it is drunk. Before the body becomes an object of physiology, it is lived. Before time is measured by clocks, it is experienced through remembering, waiting, anticipating, and hoping. Scientific knowledge is not rejected, but recognized as arising from this more fundamental world of lived experience. The first lecture concludes by challenging rigid divisions between subject and object, reason and experience, consciousness and world. Human beings are not detached spectators who first exist within themselves and subsequently construct a relationship with reality. They are embodied, situated, temporal beings already involved in a meaningful world. This insight also explains why Husserl's followers did not simply reproduce his philosophy. Scheller, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Arendt, Gadamer, and Derrida would extend the return to experience toward questions of existence, embodiment, freedom, ethics, other persons, history, language, and interpretation. Thus, in the first lecture, we established the fundamental philosophical movement of the lecture to suspend what we think we already know, return to experience, and see the world again. Let's resume with this lecture. So, in the previous slide, slide 21, the central question was largely how are things given to consciousness? In this slide, where we open today's lecture, we look at what if the human person is not first a consciousness looking at the world, but someone already living, acting, feeling, and existing within the world. Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty will push the discussion in this direction, while later on we will return to intentionality to clarify what this way of thinking actually claims about knowledge. And here we actually go immediately to Heidegger and being in the world. So we ended slide 31 by saying that human beings or human experience cannot be understood by simply separating a subject here and an object over there. Heidegger radicalizes that insight. His concern is that Husserl may still be too Cartesian. Husserl has changed our understanding of consciousness enormously, but Heidegger thinks that beginning with consciousness may already create the wrong picture. The slide therefore notes that Heidegger moves away from the language of consciousness and intentionality toward in der Welt sein, or being in the world. Let's make this very simple. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. What happens first? Do you wake up and say, I am a conscious subject? I wonder whether there is an external world? No. You wake up in a room. There is light coming through the window. There's a phone beside you, or maybe none. And you remember that you have a class. You are already late. Immediately, the world matters. The alarm is not simply an object producing sound. It means I have to get up. The door is not merely wood. It is something you open. The classroom is not merely a physical space. It is somewhere you have to be. This is Heidegger's point. We do not first encounter the world, as neutral objects. We encounter a meaningful world because we are already involved in it. This is why the expression is not simply being plus world. It is being dash in dash the dash world. Actually, it's not a dash, it's a hyphen. The hyphens matter. Human existence and world are not two completely separate things that later establish contact. We are always already involved. And Heidegger adds another idea. We are thrown into this world. You did not choose your birthplace. You did not choose your first language. You did not choose your parents. You did not choose the century into which you were born. Yet these already shape the possibilities from which your life begins. So, human existence always begins somewhere, not nowhere. And even our moods reveal this. Fear reveals the world as threatening. Boredom reveals the world as empty or uninteresting. Joy reveals possibilities. Anxiety may make familiar things suddenly seem strange. So, mood is not simply something private inside me. Mood changes how the world appears. Heidegger therefore shifts the question. Instead of asking only, how does consciousness know the world? We begin asking, what does it mean to exist in a world that already matters to us? It is along those lines that we get to know Merleau-Ponty and embodied consciousness. Merleau-Ponty now makes another decisive move. He says, in effect, if we are in the world, how are we in the world? Through the body. The slide emphasizes 3 points. The body as mediator, the priority of the directly perceived world over scientific abstraction, and the self as an absolute source of meaning while remaining irreducibly embedded in the world. But again, we need to simplify this. You do not merely have a body, you experience the world through your body. Consider your hand. A doctor can examine your hand as an object, bones, muscles, tendons, nerves, blood vessels. That is the hand as an object. But when you reach for a glass of water, you normally do not think, now I shall activate the muscles of my forearm and extend my fingers. You simply reach. Your body already knows how to inhabit the world. Or consider walking upstairs. You normally do not calculate this step is 17 centimeters high. Therefore, I must elevate my foot by 17 centimeters. Your body simply responds. This is why Merleau-Ponty distinguishes between the body as object and body as lived. My body is something that can be studied scientifically, but my body is also the place from which the world opens to me. I see from here. I hear from here. I touch from here. I suffer from here. I embrace another person from here. So the body is not simply something between the mind and the world. The body is how I am present in the world. This also explains why Merleau-Ponty does not reject science. Science tells us extraordinarily important things about the body, but before there is anatomy, there is the lived body. Before I know the physiology of pain, pain hurts. Before I understand the biology of hunger, I become hungry. Before an ophthalmologist explains vision, I already see. Scientific knowledge, therefore, begins from a world that is already perceived and lived, and that is the priority Merleau-Ponty wants us to remember. At this point, the presentation stops and corrects several misunderstandings. The slide identifies three common accusations that this philosophy is simply introspection, that it depends upon some mystical intuition, or that it represents a rejection of science. All three misunderstand the project. First, this is not simply introspection. Introspection means let me look inside myself. But what have we been discovering? Whenever we examine experience, we keep finding a world. I see a tree. I speak to another person. I use a hammer. I walk into a church. I wait for someone. I fear something. I remember somebody. The investigation of experience does not trap us inside ourselves. It actually reveals how we are related to what is not ourselves. Second, intuition here does not mean I have a mysterious feeling that this is true. That's not the intuition we're talking about. We already saw that for Husserl. Intuition concerns givenness and evidence. Something becomes present. Something shows itself. Third, this approach is not anti-science. The claim is subtler. Science is one extremely powerful way of knowing reality. But but it is not the first experience we have of reality. The scientist is already a person living in the world before becoming a scientist. So the question is not science or experience. The question is from what more basic experience does scientific knowledge arise? That distinction is very important. Now we arrive at what the slide calls Husserl's mystery of mysteries. The question is, how does objectivity get constituted in and for consciousness? This sounds extremely difficult, but we can make it understandable. There's a table in front of me. I see one side of it. You see another side. Someone enters from the opposite side and sees something different again. Yet all of us say that is the same table. How? None of us sees the whole table at once. I see it from here, you see it from there. If I move, its appearance changes, the light changes, the distance changes. Yet somehow Though all these changing appearances, or through all these changing appearances, the table is experienced as one thing. That is the mystery. How does something that is always given from a particular perspective appear as an objective thing? This is why Husserl says subjectivity cannot simply be removed from knowledge. Objectivity is achieved through situated acts of knowing. This does not mean everything is subjective, so anything goes. Quite the opposite. Husserl wants to understand how objectivity becomes possible. How can something appear differently to you, and still be recognized as the same thing? So, subjectivity is not necessarily the enemy of objectivity. Subjectivity is involved in the very achievement of objectivity. And that is a very important distinction. Here we have to distinguish Heidegger versus Husserl's claim. For Husserl, consciousness remains the site in which objectivity appears. Ego cogitatio cogitatum. For Heidegger, the central term becomes Dasein, literally their being. And the question shifts toward the appearing of being itself. Despite the difference, both are struggling with the same fundamental issue. How does a world come to appearance through human existence? Let us reduce these to two questions. Husserl asks, how does the world appear to consciousness? Heidegger asks, what kind of being are we, such that a world can appear at all? Notice the difference. Husserl begins with consciousness. Heidegger begins with existence. For Husserl, I am conscious subject directed toward the world. For Heidegger, before I begin reflecting upon myself as a subject, I already find myself existing in a meaningful world. Think again of the classroom. Husserl might ask, how is the classroom given to consciousness? How do I perceive its unity? How does it retain identity as I move around? Heidegger asks something slightly different. What is a classroom for me? A place of teaching, learning, responsibility, anxiety before an examination, friendship, authority, boredom, possibility. The room appears through the kind of life being lived there. So Heidegger's concern is not merely how do I know the room? It is how does this room belong to the world in which I exist? That is the movement from consciousness toward existence. This leads us to the structure of intentionality. Now that the presentation returns to intentionality, because we need to understand it more precisely. The slide states Husserl's basic thesis. Conscious experiences are characterized by aboutness. Loving, seeing, thinking, remembering, fearing, each is directed toward something. The object need not even physically exist for the act to possess meaning. We introduced this earlier through Brentano. Now we deepen it. Suppose I say, I remember my grandmother. My grandmother may no longer be physically present, yet the remembering is still about her. Or I fear failing tomorrow's examination. The failure has not happened. It may never happen, but my fear is still directed toward a possible event. Or I imagine a unicorn. There may be no unicorn, but the imagination is still about something. This tells us something very important. The meaning of experience cannot simply depend upon whether the object physically exists. Consciousness relates not only to actual things, it relates to the remembered, the imagined, the feared, the hoped for, the desired, the possible, and the absent. Our human world is therefore much larger than what is immediately physically present. Think of how much of your life today is organized by things that are not here. Tomorrow's meeting, yesterday's argument, a person you miss, a deadline next month, a promise you made, a future you hope for. Human beings live among presences and absences, and intentionally helps us understand how this is possible. The noetic and the noematic structure. Now we enter some difficult vocabulary. Remember, we're still introducing phenomenology. The ego cogitatio cogitatum. The self, the conscious act, the objective correlate or meaning. We can make this very simple. Imagine a candle. There is I who see, there is my act of seeing, and there is the candle as seen. Now close your eyes and remember the candle. There is still the I. There is now, remembering, and there is the candle as remembered. Notice something. The candle as seen and the candle as remembered are not given in exactly the same way. Now imagine the candle burning down the church. Some same possible object, but now the candle as feared. Or imagine the candle being used during Easter Vigil. Now the candle as symbolically experienced. The object may be physically identical, but the mode in which it becomes meaningful changes with the act. This is what the noematic structure helps us analyze. The noetic side concerns the act, seeing, remembering, imagining, loving, fearing. The noematic side concern the object as experienced through that act. So experience has structure. It's not simply subject object. It is most of the time someone experiencing a particular act of experiencing and something as experienced. This is why the diagram is useful. It visually connects the ego, cogitatio, and cogitatum rather than treating them as isolated pieces. Now, of course, intentionality will change after Husserl. Now, the students of this movement begin moving in different directions. The slide gives us Levinas, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, and each receives intentionality but transforms it. Levinas asks, what happens when what I encounter is another person? Can another human being ever be completely reduced to my understanding of them? Suppose I say, I know exactly what kind of person you are. Levinas becomes suspicious because perhaps the other person always exceeds my categories. The other is not simply an object for me to understand. The other makes a demand upon me. So intentionality begins moving toward ethics. Sartre takes another direction. For Sartre, consciousness is always reaching beyond what is presently is. I'm never simply finished. I project possibilities. I imagine what I can become. But this also creates instability. I want to become something solid, a successful person, a good teacher, a priest, a scholar, a respected professional. Yet, no identity completely captures me. I always exceed what I presently am. So intentionality becomes connected with freedom. Merleau-Ponty still takes another direction. He says that consciousness and world are so deeply intertwined that we cannot fully separate them. May katawan ako, pero ako rin yung aking katawan. I touch the world, but the world also touches me. I see, but I am also visible. My body belongs to the world that it perceives. So intentionality becomes increasingly embodied and relational. Three thinkers, three directions. Levinas, the other, Sartre, freedom, Merleau-Ponty, embodiment, and intertwining. And yet, all three inherit the same basic insight. Human existence is always beyond itself, directed toward something other than itself. And this leads us to the paradox between phenomenology and Cartesianism. Now we arrive at a paradox. The slide says Husserl tries to overcome crude Cartesianism by radically rethinking the Cartesian project itself. Ang galing. Heidegger and Levinas nevertheless regard Husserl's project as a high point of cogito philosophy, while Sartre still regards it as Cartesian in spirit. Why is Descartes still here? Remember Descartes? Cogito sum or cogito ergo sum. Mapuputol. I hope not. I think, I am, or I think, therefore